Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Startups Going Remote. I'm Kristen Savell, one of the managing directors of the Rock Center for Corporate Governance at Stanford. A couple quick housekeeping matters and then we'll get started. We are recording today's session and we will make that recording available on the Rock Center website sometime next week. We will be taking audience questions at the end of today's session, so please add your questions in the Q&A box. And finally, we will post a link to an evaluation form in the chat box shortly. Please fill that out if you get a chance. We really do value your feedback. And if you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, you'll need to add your name and your bar number to the second part of the evaluation form. Okay, let's get started. I'm gonna ask each of our speakers to introduce themselves. Christine, do you wanna kick us off?
Sure, thank you, Kristen. I'm Christine Matthews. I lead a team of 75 HR consultants and recruiters as part of OneDigital, which is a nationwide people services firm. And we provide outsourced HR and talent services on a fractional basis to help startup companies get up off the ground. And while OneDigital provides services across the country, my team is located here in Silicon Valley, and we focus mostly on the biotech and technology industries.
Great, thank you. Rami?
Hi, my name is Rami Assad. I'm co-founder and CEO of Finmark. Finmark is financial planning software for startups, helping companies better manage their runway burn and forward forecasts. This is my third company, so I've been a serial entrepreneur. I'm also an investor in startups. So I've been deep into the startup space and have run companies both remote and with offices.
Great, and Shiva?
Hi there, I'm Shiva Gosmivani, and I'm a partner in the Litigation and Employment Practices groups at Fenwick. I've worked with over about 1,000 companies in my career focusing on employment law, so I've seen a lot, and of those clients, mostly startups. So I've got a lot of good benchmarking information.
Great. All right, so just to give you an overview of what we are going to cover today, we'll start by setting the stage and defining some terms. And then we will talk about what a hybrid workplace actually means. And finally, we will discuss some of the compliance, compensation, and human capital management challenges of shifting to a hybrid or remote workplace, and we'll offer some tips for navigating those challenges. All right, so I have a couple slides here to help set the stage. So I'm gonna share my screen. And these slides just depict how American workers are currently thinking about remote and flexible work arrangements. So it turns out, not surprisingly, that remote work is popular. People like to sit around in their pajamas all day, or perhaps that's just me. So based on one study of US employees, 82% said they would want to work remotely at least once a week when the pandemic is over. And about a third of workers would actually take a pay decrease in order to be able to do so. So the pandemic changed not only where we work, but also how we think about work. So we're seeing this great resignation of workers who are leaving the workforce. Some maybe permanently, others who are looking for more money, more happiness, and it turns out more flexibility. So 56% of American workers are prioritizing flexible work arrangements in their next job opportunity. 81% said they would be more loyal to an employer who offers flexible work. And when asked what they would do if they were not allowed to work remotely after the pandemic, 54% said they would stay with their employer, but be less willing to go the extra mile. And 46% said they would look for another job. So clearly, flexibility is important to workers moving forward. A significant number would actually be willing to shift jobs in order to attain that flexibility. So it's not surprising that as startups are grappling with whether to bring employees back to the office, many are actually considering shifting to a permanently hybrid or remote workforce. So I've already thrown out a number of these terms like hybrid, remote, flexible. There are so many of these terms out there. Rami, can you identify some of the workplace models and define them so that we're all on the same page, at least for purposes of this conversation? And I'm gonna pull up one slide that will help with that conversation.
Yeah, well, you know, there's the very far end of the spectrum that says we're going to be all in an office 100%, right? And the other end of the spectrum is we're going to be only remote. Those are kind of the two extremes, but what most employers are finding today, and what most companies I think are finding, is that you need some gradient in the middle, right? And that gradient can be pretty broad. This list gives us a definition to help us start understanding the differences, right? There's remote first, which is kind of one step below remote only. And remote first means that most employees are going to work from home. We may have an office. We might invite people to come into the office, but we prioritize the culture around being remote first. It can mean things like we make sure that all meetings are done out of the office. It may mean that we make sure that we think first about how do we invest in tooling to enable people out of the office. There's no mandatory requirement to come in, right? There's office occasionally where we want people to come into the office a little bit, right? This is the other end of the spectrum where you're not forcing everybody to come in all the time, but you want people to come in some of the time. And then that's very, very close to office first, right? Which is that extreme of you want your employees to come in, but you may make some flexible allocations to some people to not come in. Then there's a little bit in the middle of fully flexible where we as an employer don't have a preference. We don't care if you come in or you don't come in. In all of these different definitions, and there's probably gradients in between, it's really about what do we set as employers as a guidance for our employees, right? What are we pushing out to employees to say, this is what our preference is, and this is the boundary that you have to kind of abide by. So this is by no means the full list of what you can have, and this may not be the exact wording that you might use, but this is kind of hopefully starting to give you a little bit of a framework to think about, where do I want to land in this world of hybrid remote work?
Great, thanks, Rami. Stop sharing for a minute here. Now we've got some definitions on the board, which is great. Let's talk about some of the pros and cons of the different workplace models. And let's focus on the main three, the 100% in office, 100% remote, and hybrid. Christine, do you want to start us off there?
Sure. So for the 100% in office, clearly we're going to have a real advantage to having people collaborate together with their teams across the company and have the kind of relationship building and team building that has gone on to date, and that's harder to accomplish in a virtual environment. The con, of course, is that you heard from the statistics just presented that being remote, it's at least some part of our work days, is very important to people these days. And it's the hottest talent market we've seen perhaps ever. And so that's going to be a competitive disadvantage, having everybody return to the office post-pandemic, if you will. And then if you think about the reverse, like the other extreme, like Rami was saying about how everybody is remote, it's a little bit the reverse in terms of pros and cons. You've got the competitive advantage of being attractive to an employee, being able to retain people, in this kind of competitive market where people want remote situations, but it's harder to find ways to really bond as a team and get work done cross-functionally. And then the hybrid approach can be the best of all worlds if it's done right, because you've got the advantages of both the in-person in the office and the remote available. And what I think is the con on that one is that it takes a lot of planning and organization to really optimize how do you use that in-person time and what are the logistics around how do you arrange a really strong for your culture hybrid work environment.
Rami or Shiva, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add, if you're going fully remote, and by that also meaning you let employees work anywhere in the US or abroad, we're going to get to this a little more detail later. But in that instance, a con is just the administrative headache of dealing with workers that are dispersed and the laws you have to comply with. The pro is similar to what Christine mentioned, is you're more attractive to candidates and it can be really good retention and recruiting tool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And also one thing I want to mention is you can also compete for talent if you aren't, wedded to an office across the entire country and across the entire world. And that in this hot labor market is another real advantage to being remote only.
Yeah, I think, the biggest pros and cons really come from the talent pool that's going to be available to you and what the talent pools are going to demand. I think right now, because of the experience of the pandemic, a lot of people we're focused on a lot of people that want to have remote work. I also foresee a potential in the future where we're going to have the opposite, where so many people might correct for working, remotely, that there's going to be some people that miss being together, collaborative, being in the office, right? Not everybody's an introvert. Some extroverts really need the social environment of an office. And that's going to making a decision on what you want to allow for is going to open up or close off certain talent pools to you. And I think that's what's going to be the most interesting pro and con as you make a decision and as this workforce evolves over the next couple of years.
Very good point. One thing that we haven't really touched on is cost. And I'm going to share my screen and put up a slide again. Okay. So one consulting firm has created this teleworks savings calculator where you can try to quantify the financial savings from having a single worker telecommute 50% of the time per year. So according to this tool, an employer can save almost $11,000 per half-time telecommuter per year. And the primary savings are the result of increased productivity, reduced real estate costs, and lower absenteeism and turnover. An employee can save around $3,000 per year, and that's net of extra costs from working from home. And those savings are primarily due to savings in travel, food, parking, and dry cleaning expenses. You can also see significant environmental and community cost savings in terms of reduced greenhouse gas emissions and reduced reliance on oil and gas. So I made an assumption here of 50 employees, but you can actually play around with the tool and enter information specific to your company in order to get a more accurate estimate of savings. So clearly there are some cost savings involved with having employees work remotely. I'm curious, Christine, are there certain startups, whether based on size or fundraising stage or industry, that are just better positioned to take advantage of remote or hybrid work?
Well, up front, I think you shared a statistic that about 37% of all US jobs, can't be done, in the remotely completely. And so I think industry plays a huge role in determining people's flexibility around whether they have options to do either remote only or hybrid. If you think about hospital industry, construction, physical therapists, nurses, there's so many, retail where they're, manufacturing is a huge one, right? So the industries that I see regularly that really have tremendous opportunities around this, we work in one of them. It's the technology industry on the software side, right? Not the hardware side, because you've got to have manufacturing there. And then for things like professional services, law firms, tax, marketing, people that have client bases can often work remotely. So industry, I think, is a huge determining factor of optionality around this. And then with regard to size, even pre-pandemic, before all these trends started taking place, we would see our seed companies often be virtual for quite some time until they got enough traction to where they wanted to spend the money per, what you're saying, as well as in terms of the cost and get a site. So I think smaller companies can also get away with being virtual more easily than larger companies.
Yeah, I couldn't echo that more. I think size has, in every startup I've started and worked at, size has been a really big factor in how easy it is for us to collaborate online versus collaborate in person. One thing that wasn't in the calculator that I think is something that you want to consider is the logistics of still building culture and still bringing people together. Even if you're remote only, that doesn't mean that you don't necessarily have you have zero face time. And that's coming back to the idea of a size. It's a lot easier to get together as a group of 5, 10, 25 men and women versus when you get to 100 or 200 people, creating the logistics around bringing everybody together for periodic events gets to be a lot harder.
Well, Rami, actually, can you tell us about your workplace model at your current startup? And is that a model that you adopted before the pandemic, or did you end up shifting during the pandemic?
So I sold my last company right before the pandemic in 2019. That was a company where we had 5 offices globally. We had a few employees that worked remotely, but we really centralized around those 5 offices. The 300 employees that I had centralized around those 5 offices. I was a big proponent of office culture. I thought it made for better collaboration. I started this latest company during the pandemic. And so it was, just as a matter of necessity, we started it remotely. I had the added benefit of bringing in mostly employees that worked for me before, which meant that we had a pre-built culture around that. And as we got it started, as we started hiring people, we realized we want to make this a forever thing, not just a pandemic thing. And we decided, let's go ahead and just say we're going to be remote only from here on out. And so we've made the conscientious decision, even post-pandemic, that we're going to stay remote only, or at least at the very minimum, remote first.
And why did you make that decision?
Well, what starting off in a remote world did is it allowed me to pick the best person for every single position, regardless of geography. And so I have employees in 5 different countries and all around the US. I've already, of the 34 employees that we have now, they're already so far spread out that I don't have a single concentration area that I can build an office around. And that created a much better dynamic. To be able to pick and choose the exact person for the exact role and pay less for it, frankly, than some tier 1 cities, made it so that we were more efficient as a company, and so there's no turning back, I think, at this point.
Mm-hmm. And are you VC backed right now?
We are. Yeah, we're backed by a number of VCs.
Okay. Did you worry that embracing a remote workplace model would impact your fundraising ability or your exit prospects? And have you seen any impact, whether positive or negative?
That's a really great question. I want to answer it both from past experience and this one and the current experience. We actually relocated headquarters of my last company to San Francisco because we actually saw an impact both from fundraising and from exit potentials of my last company. So we purposefully, early on in our life cycle, moved headquarters to San Francisco because we felt like being away from potential acquirers made it harder for us to get acquired. In this company now, having gone through the M&A process in selling our last company, I didn't actually worry about where our employees are. At the end of the day, I realized that the employer wants the talent pool. If you have a good synergetic working environment today, the employer won't care how that's going to play out, unless it's an acqui-hire situation, right? If you're getting acqui-hired, they want to roll you in. But if you're getting, more traditionally acquired, then they want to kind of keep you guys together. You're already working as a cohesive unit, so I don't worry about that. And I have seen investors broaden out their investment thesis, right? Traditionally, one of the reasons that we moved out to San Francisco is a lot of investors passed on us for our Series A when I was running Distill, because they said we're not in the Valley. Maybe, if we were closer, they would feel more comfortable investing in us. This time around, investors, geography didn't come in to play at all.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And Christine or Shiva, anything to add there? Should startups think about fundraising and exit prospects as they're deciding on a particular workplace model?
Well, I've seen the increased flexibility from the venture capital firms that invest in our companies the same way Rami is describing it. And I can't tell you the number of startup company CEOs that are coming to us these days who have already set up maybe some operations in a couple of places, but have people distributed all around not only the country, but the globe. So the whole game has changed, and everybody's mindset from VCs all the way to CEOs, all the way to partners has changed. So for example, just with my own firm, which actually became part of One Digital last June, we were really centered only in Silicon Valley pre-pandemic. And now we're serving clients all over the nation. And I've gone to hiring people all over the nation too. So it's really a huge trend in a completely different direction. It'll be interesting to see how it nets out over time.
Great. Well, let's.
Yeah. One thing Rami said that I want to echo though, is that I also believe the demographics of the younger generation in particular are really going to want to push for some more in-person time than this fully remote situation. I think that's going to be an impact that people need to take into account as they try to plan for their workplaces.
Right. That's a good point. We showed a slide earlier in the session with the different variations of the hybrid workplace model. There's obviously a ton of variation, and that doesn't even fully capture it. Christine, I'm curious, are there one or two hybrid models that you are seeing most often among your clients? And then Shiva, I'll ask the same question to you. And also, is there a particular model that you would recommend?
Well, what I'm seeing most often is hybrid, and people requiring 1 to 3, and some of them are not doing this yet, but they're planning for it. So they're still remote only, but with an eye toward the hybrid. And the hybrid models we're either seeing in effect now or planned for are where people would be in the office either 1, 2, or 3 days a week, and 2 kind of being the most common that I'm seeing. But again, just as I mentioned, in terms of a dynamic, it's interesting because a lot of companies have maybe some hubs where they've got a bunch of people in San Francisco and a bunch of people in New York, but then everyone else is distributed. So they may be running a hybrid model for a couple of their specific geographies and a remote only model around the edges for all the rest of their employees. So it's almost a nuanced in the middle, kind of when Rami presented the nuances. It's one of those nuanced kind of models that we're seeing a lot of. And in terms of what I would recommend, I mean, I think if you can bring people together regularly, it's a good idea to do so. And so the hybrid model, when it works with your logistics, I think is what I would recommend.
And Shiva, what about you? Is there a particular hybrid variation that you're seeing most often among your clients? And is there a variation that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I agree with Christine. I'm seeing a lot of the 1 to 3 days a week, but the majority of my clients are still pretty much either remote only or remote first. And to Christine's point, are just thinking about what this will look like. My general, I can't really opine on what I'd recommend because it's such a company by company decision, company culture, logistics, everything else. But I would say when you're thinking about this, think about your workforce, your company culture, and what you think will work for you, at least for the next couple of months. Because what I tell clients is it's still TBD. We have no idea how this is all going to pan out. The pendulum may swing to Christine's earlier point where people may really want to be in the office at some point. So I would just remain flexible and be mindful of that when you're communicating to your employees. Hey, this is our model for now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I do think that there's going to be a lot of swinging back and forth before we really feel out what's happening. And I think, through the next maybe 12 months, even right through 22, having flexibility in how you think about it, how you communicate to your employees will be important. Now, if you want to make a decision, one thing that I would recommend is creating structure and clarity. I think that's really, really important. There's one option in the hybrid model where we don't have a preference as an employer. You do what you want. That's to me, I think the least beneficial way, because it's very hard to plan around things, right? When you decide, hey, we're going to be remote first, or we're going to be in office first, then you can start setting expectations. The meetings are going to be primarily together, right? Or the meetings are primarily going to be remote. That changes the dynamic very much so, right? If you're calling in to a meeting and everybody else is in the room, you're going to kind of be left out, and you need a plan to try to find ways to get into the meeting. Versus if you're remote first, you say, hey, we're going to do only remote meetings so everybody has an equal playing field, right? So creating structure around what you do, if you decide to put a flag in the ground now, I think is really, really important, so that you can set the right expectations with people and build around that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would think that for workers that are operating under a hybrid model, that most would choose to come in Tuesday through Thursday and work remotely Monday and Friday. At least that's what I would choose. Is that a problem? Should employees have flexibility to determine when and how often they come to the office, or should some of that be dictated from above? Christine, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Rami, you already started talking about this, and I agree with what you said. I think, the free-for-all misses a huge opportunity to leverage, and also what Shiva, you said about culture is also super important, to leverage the value of that precious in-person time. If you're going to do a hybrid model, you've got to think through it carefully to really get the advantages of that in-person time. And so, think about, for me, a guiding principle would be have intact work teams come to the office on the same days. And then you could think about beyond that, are there intact work teams that work really closely with other, intact work teams, and have that group of intact work teams together on Monday, Wednesday, and a different set of intact work teams on Tuesday, Thursday. And then if you can give some optionality for people, like you have and that gets into the logistics, right? Then, people can choose a third day if they want to. That's great. But I do think it needs to be company dictated in order to get the advantages to both the employee, actually from an employee engagement, organization, all the expectation setting structure that Rami talked about, I completely agree with, and to get the advantages of it. So I think that the key about this whole question is that there is no one size fits all. There is no answer. And I completely agree with Shiva about staying fluid. Like, we need to have companies look at three main things, I think. What is the work that's being accomplished? How much of it can be done remotely? How much of it would be a real advantage to be done in person? Then what is the company culture and the values? And how do we want to create that employee engagement experience, which is a huge part, by the way, in this competitive talent market of attracting and retaining our talent? And then you've got the logistics as that third component. You've got certain space, certain geography, certain size to work with, and you need to be planful and thoughtful about how to make all those factors come together to make it a good experience for the company and for the employees in it.
And then, Rami, what about management? Are they following the same schedule of the employees, or do you feel like they are subject to a different set of rules?
I think it's very reasonable to be okay with setting two different sets of guidelines for management versus individual contributors or lower level managers. Upper level management you may say, hey, we're remote first, or we're remote only for all of our employees, but we really need managers to come together, the executives to come together on a more regular basis. I think there's a lot more to be said around the synergy of the executive team and making sure that they're operating. I don't think there's ever a place where all employees are mandatory in the office and the executives are remote, but you might have more stringent requirements about bringing executives together. I think it's totally fine to create a kind of a bifurcation there. The only thing that you want to make sure that you think about is what happens to the upward potential of employees, if that's your theory, right? If you say, hey, we're okay with you being remote, and you have a high performer that's outside of your core area, what happens if you want to promote that person? Do you have to bring them back to kind of be closer to the executives to get them in, to get her involved into the executive team? Or is that, are you going to then be forced with a decision where you now have to spread it out, right? So you have to be diligent and thoughtful about that and set that expectation across the whole company so that your remote employees understand that they may not get a chance to be promoted if they're not local.
Well, let's actually talk about that a little bit more, because it's true in a hybrid work environment in particular, some employees may have a lot of face-to-face time with management, and some may have very little or none at all. And managers may unintentionally favor the employees they physically see in the office, in part because they think they have a better understanding of that employee's performance. So how do you ensure equal advancement opportunities for employees who are less visible to management. I can open that to anyone.
I mean, I can start. I really think that there's going to be some corner cases. And Rami described one, which is how do you, if you've got someone who, if the executives are in the office a lot, and that's expectation, which by the way, we're seeing at a lot of our clients, the executives are the ones that tend to be in the office more than anybody else, which, you know, the corollary shouldn't be acceptable, which Rami articulated. But I think you can do an awful lot toward equal opportunity by having really robust talent management practices in place. And so what I mean by that is like if the corporate goals are very clear and then they cascade down to every single person in the organization so that they have a list of goals and accountabilities and results that they're expected to drive. And you have, that's step one. And then you have really good managers that are, you know, checking in regularly, managing effectively. They've been trained to do so. They're providing feedback and recognition and guidance. That's step two. And by the way, strong managers are a huge part of attracting and retaining talent in this very competitive market. So you want, that's a multidimensional reason you want that. And then the third part of that cycle is you have to have a good assessment process. And whether you're doing it twice a year, whether you're doing it once a year, where you link the results that people are driving with the rewards that they're getting, including promotions, including compensation and other opportunities. Now, there will be the corner cases that Rami described, but if you have a process like this in place, I think it gives everybody maximum opportunity. There's one additional piece to making that process really work well, especially in startups when they're not too large. You can do talent reviews at the executive team level. And what I like to do is have every executive team member present once a year at least on the results to the goals and the key contributions, the strengths, the areas for growth of every single team member, get feedback from the other members of the team. So you get a collective 360 on it. And then the visibility is equal. Everybody's got a slide and it is discussed in this talent review. So nobody gets lost. Now, it doesn't mean that there won't be those corner cases of a bunch of water cooler conversation that deepens a relationship that unconsciously, you know, drives it in a certain direction, or that corner case Rami described where you've got somebody at the senior director level, for example, and you want to promote that person to VP level, and they're not geographically desirable to be part of your regular executive team. Those are one-offs that will have to grapple with, that will be challenges. But as an overall cycle, if you have good talent management in place, I think you do provide the maximum optimization of equal opportunity for people in a remote setting.
And let's be clear, this isn't a new issue that's coming up because of the remote work or pandemic. This has always existed, right? Favoritism happens, bias happens because of being human, right? It is being exacerbated, right? If you have zero connectivity, zero interpersonal connectivity with a remote person, but then you see somebody else 100% of the time, it just exacerbates the problem. This isn't a new problem. It's just a lot worse in a hybrid or remote environment. And so you have to be even more diligent to do the right processes. Like Christine says, I couldn't agree more. Setting the right performance reviews and being objective around how you're measuring the performance of your employees is the only way to try to eliminate that bias.
Particularly too, if you end up, like, for example, let's say it just so happens that you have more female employees that choose remote work, maybe for childcare reasons or other familial reasons, and now we're disadvantaging them in the promotion process. That would be a big problem from a discrimination standpoint and just from a culture and what's fair perspective. So that's something to also consider as well and think about when you're talking about advancement of employees who are remote.
Good point. All right, so I want to talk now about making the transition from in-office to hybrid or remote. And obviously the ability to work remotely allows employees to move to different cities or states or even countries. But there are serious compliance risks that arise when you employ workers in different jurisdictions. So Shiva, can you walk us through some of the key compliance issues that startups should be thinking about before they permit their employees to relocate out of state? And I've got some slides that I'm going to share that will help us to walk through this with you because there is a lot to unpack.
That is very true. The first kind of big issue is that the compliance for employment, employment law, et cetera, is a state by state beast. I think there's a misconception that, oh, if we just do one thing, it works for everybody across the United States. And that is definitely not true, particularly in states like California, where I am, in New York. We like to consider ourselves really special when it comes to employment laws. And so our employment laws often deviate from the federal standard and other jurisdictions. So that's piece one. And that can be really hard to navigate if you're a little startup and you don't have an HR department, you don't have a legal department, which a lot of my startups don't. So that can be really tough. It can be challenging. It, in some instances, will mean that you might be better off considering a PEO, a professional employer organization, or an organization like Christine's, where you have somebody who you can consult with for these other states where you might not be registered or have more information. Speaking of registration, there's a whole process that you have to go about when you're going to be an employer in a state. You can't just sort of show up and all of a sudden employ people. And one of them is you have to register as an employer in most states. And the threshold is really low. It's often if you have one worker, like one or more workers, and now you have to go through the headache of registering as an employer. And you often have to set up an unemployment insurance account with the state government, make sure your workers' comp insurance complies with that particular state's laws, and other items that, again, can be really difficult to do. Not impossible, I don't want to oversell that, but it just is more of an administrative challenge. State-specific payroll, right? So again, you got to set up the payroll to payroll someone in that jurisdiction. So if I'm a California headquartered company and somebody moved to New York, I need to be complying with New York law for that employee. What I tell my startups is it's the law of where the worker is for everything, not just payroll, but employment laws that apply, local laws that apply, et cetera. And then registration as a business or corporate entity is often required in another state. So there's registration as the employer, then there's registration as a business or a corporate entity. And then again, just that the compliance, not only in the employment law is it from a federal level, it's a state level, and it's a local level. Particularly again in California, San Francisco, LA, we've got our own local ordinances. New York City has its own. Seattle have their own. So it's just really important to make sure you're getting all of that compliance in order.
And Shiva, does it matter if you're employing people full-time versus fixed term or freelance?
So really the distinction would be employee or non-employee worker, like a contractor, consultant. That's where a big distinction occurs. Whether it's part-time or full-time. Sorry, I'm hearing an echo. Whether there's part-time or full-time, that isn't really the big distinction. It's, are you an employee or are you a contractor? And what are the laws that are going to apply to you based on those designations?
Okay.
I'll just say, having been doing this for the past, year and a half, there's the added consideration that the states right now are actually really backed up. New York, for example, took us 3.5 months to get registered as a business when I hired an employee in New York. And that created all sorts of headache. It blocked payroll for a while. It's doable, as Shiva said, but it is painful. And once you get involved in a state, it could also open you up to other liabilities in terms of creating tax nexus for the products and services that you might be selling, right? So as soon as you bring in employees there, it can open up a whole nother can of worms of things that you have to consider.
Yeah, and given that, it's a really good point. And given that, I think folks should think about, do we come up with like a list of here are the states that we're comfortable with our employees moving to? And I have had clients do that. If they're not ready to just open up the oyster of the entire United States, they'll look into the biggies like California, Florida, New York, Texas, Washington, particularly in tech, and say, okay, we're approving X many states. Here's where they are. We've already gone through the legwork, and you need to get approval before you move to these states, but you aren't approved to move outside of them unless we provide an exception.
Thanks. Sorry, I changed the slide a little prematurely as Rami was
No, it's okay.
tax issue. But Shiva, can you walk us through some of the additional risks that arise when startups employ U.S. workers who move overseas?
Yeah, we have been seeing a surge, and I'm sure Christine would agree, just a surge of interest in hiring foreign talent. And I think that existed, of course, before the pandemic, but I've seen a surge of it during the pandemic, just given wanting to open up the labor market to Rami's point earlier. I want to kind of hire the right person for this role and not be constrained by geography. So just like other states in the United States, each country has its own employment laws that you have to comply with. In Europe, and particularly in the UK and other European countries, notoriously, it's really complex and very employee friendly. And so if you need to terminate someone, you may be thinking, oh, well, here in the United States, it's at will. Well, that is not the case in many other countries. You have to jump through a lot of hoops, go through a lot of processes. So you need to be really mindful and try to, there's a sort of, oh, I don't know what I don't know. Well, you need to know it. So make sure you consult with the right experts. Same thing with payroll and withholding and any kind of benefits. You would have to do that in compliance with foreign law if this is a foreign employee. And part of that is even, can you employ that person in another country? Are you set up as a company to employ that person? Because again, you can't just all of a sudden hire somebody in the UK without having the proper registration, proper corporate entity. And that can be really, really expensive. So with international folks, what I often see is either they're making the international worker a contractor and taking on some risk of misclassification and taxes, which we'll get into in a second, or using what we call an EOR, or employer of record. So you may have heard of like Remote, Deal. There's several out there that are pretty popular that our clients are using, where that employer of record does what it says. It becomes the employer of record, handles, you're basically outsourcing that administrative headache. And then on the tax piece, you're definitely taking on potential risk. It's this fancy terminology called permanent establishment. What it basically means is if you have a worker in a foreign country, should you be taxed on your business operations in that foreign country by the fact that you have that worker? And is that worker a revenue generating worker, like a salesperson? Because if they are, higher likelihood that you're going to have what's called, again, a permanent establishment.
Go ahead.
I want to, if I could, reinforce what Shiva had said about employers of record. In my last company, I had to set up 3 international subsidiaries. It was a tremendous amount of work and cost and continued maintenance. It wasn't just a one-time thing, but maintaining those entities was very, very difficult. I have employees across the world now using a Deal, which is one of the services that you mentioned, Shiva, and it makes life so much easier. It's reduced the cost burden significantly. The one area that it hasn't reduced, going to an employer, an EOR service as opposed to having a subsidiary, is the options considerations, right? Most startups, we may try to discount our salaries for the employees that we're hiring by providing options. And internationally, it is just this wild mess of how options are considered from country to country, right? Not only is it sometimes hard for you as a company to provide options, you might accidentally create a tax burden on your employees on unrealized gains, right? There's a number of European countries, a number of countries abroad, where just by issuing options, you're creating a tax burden on your employees. And you definitely, absolutely, before you hire international employees, and if you want to give them equity in your company, talk to an attorney about this. This isn't something that you can do alone. In some countries, you might have to convert them to warrants. You might have to set up, a different class of shares. There's a lot of legwork around giving equity to international employees. And that is one disadvantage of trying to hire internationally versus just staying, remote in the US versus remote anywhere in the world as a startup, because equity is such a big part of our compensation.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. It's a real challenge to deal with equity. And obviously you want to be able to treat your employees the same. So there's a big interest in doing that. The other piece I would mention real quickly too on international compliance that may not be top of mind is protection of IP. So, some countries aren't super friendly to protecting IP and are more interested in potentially harboring an environment where people can use IP and misappropriate IP. So I'll often talk to clients and they'll say, we're going to have like an embargo list of here are the countries you can't work in. So examples would be like North Korea, Russia, et cetera. So that's something to think about. And I have had clients who have had employees in different countries, foreign countries, who have absconded away with IP, and it's extremely hard to enforce your IP rights abroad. So again, it's not something that would come top of mind, but I'd want to raise that up in people's mind because of how important protection of your IP is.
Thanks, Shiva. Staying on top of all of these issues for every worker in all these different states and countries where they may live or relocate seems really overwhelming, particularly for smaller and leaner startups. Do you have any advice for startups that are trying to navigate this complexity and stay in compliance with local laws and regulations? You guys have mentioned a couple like consulting experts and the employer of record, but any other tips or best practices that you can share?
So I would just say, really the only thing I would add to it is have, especially if you're going to do hybrid, but even if you're not, like draft a remote work or relocation policy, because what we saw, at least what I saw during the middle and early parts of the pandemic, is employees were just picking up and moving, selling houses, matriculating their kids in other states. There was just a lot of stuff going on, and it was all for likely very good reason, wanting to be close to family, better cost of living. But our clients were often caught unawares and thinking, well, wait, what's going on? Now I all of a sudden have somebody in Texas. I didn't even know that. I haven't been payrolling them, in compliance with that state's law. So put together a policy so that it's super clear to your employees what your expectations are, particularly the fact that this requires advance approval, because there's nothing worse than finding out after the fact. Some people, it turned out, clients only found out when the person was like leaving the company, resigning and leaving the company. All of a sudden they're like, oh, well, guess what? I actually live in Kansas now. And the company had no clue, and it had been going on for many, many months.
Mm-hmm. Great point.
Yeah, I have to say I've seen that happen to multiple clients as well. And I couldn't agree more with Shiva in terms of putting in a very clear policy that requires approval and then has parameters. And for example, around compensation, reserves the right to adjust compensation if needed. Not that we'd want to do that right now in this hot market, but it has been kind of a free-for-all that people are trying to recover from now.
Well, thank you for raising the compensation point. I want to get in one last question here, and then I'll turn to the audience. But about compensation, there's been a lot of debate around whether you should reduce salary for people who move from expensive cities into less expensive areas. So Christine, I'm curious, what are you seeing among your startup clients? And are there any best practices that you can generalize?
I mean, we basically touched on this a minute ago, but what I will say is that conventional wisdom would say that if people are moving out of the area to much less expensive areas, that you do want to have adjustments. And over the years I've been running this practice, we've done that when people move to North Carolina or other places. But number one, everybody was caught off guard, just like Shiva and I were saying, and people were gone and not even sure where people are. And the second thing is, as I've done a kind of informal survey of our clients recently, almost nobody is actually cutting salaries. And I would recommend not cutting salaries right now, even though it may be a very interesting dynamic for the future to contend with. Right now, the labor market is so tight, and we're seeing such hot competition for people, for attracting them and retaining them, whether you want to call it the great resignation or the great reshuffling or what have you. It's not really the time to be doing a lot of salary reductions. Now, of course, there'll be corner cases that should be evaluated. But I just again reinforce what Shiva said. You've got to have a policy. And for me, even running my own team, like about 6 months ago, I said, whoa, wait a minute, somebody just moved to Chico. So same kind of thing we were experiencing. And so I said, okay, the people are gone, are now grandfathered for now. But moving forward, you have to have approval to move in advance. And it's subject to a telecommuting policy and, reserving the right to adjust compensation now or in the future. You can adjust it down, reduce it. That's not happening much at all in a practical way right now. There are some clients that are kind of freezing salary increases for people that have moved out of the area to much lower cost areas. And so that over time that would catch up. I think this is going to be something that we really contend with as things continue to be fluid and move over the next 12 to 24 months. Both Rami and Shiva have said that that's the case. We haven't landed here, but for now, people aren't really adjusting compensation. And it's going to be a real interesting dynamic as when things do land.
And Shiva, are you seeing about the same thing with your clients?
I am. I think we have to look at who's driving this. The employee workforce, the candidates out there are saying, why should I get paid less if I just choose to live somewhere with lower cost of living when I'm doing the same work? And you also have to think about, from a discrimination standpoint, again, if you have a class of employees that moves outside of the state to a lower cost area, and now all of a sudden you're dropping their salary or you're freezing their salary, and their peers doing the same or substantially similar work are getting increases, then you have an inequity that could be significant from a legal perspective, from a pay equity perspective. So I would just be careful about that. In addition to Christine's point of like, this talent market is so hot, I could see employees saying, well, no, I'm just going to go somewhere else where they're going to pay me a market rate.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Or more.
Or more.
Okay, I want to turn to some audience questions. One person asked, what's the best practice for employee handbooks when employees are scattered across the country? Do you have an addendum for each state employees are located?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, Shiva, this is yours.
Yeah. So it's a tough one, but what I generally tell clients, especially if you're a little baby startup, if you are based in California or based in New York, like, pick where you're generally based, make your handbook compliant with that law, with the laws of that state. And then think about when you gain critical mass in other states, then you can think about, do I put an addendum in place? Do I, insert policies from other states? It is usually cost prohibitive, as Christine, I'm sure, would agree, to like give you a 50 state survey handbook. Like that's, and really long, right? That's going to be a handbook none of your employees are going to read. It's going to be too long and just too complicated. So that's generally my advice, is stick with where you're headquartered or where you have critical mass, rather than trying to thread the needle on like one person that lives in Kentucky. Probably not worth over indexing for that in the handbook.
Mm-hmm. All right, so when you have a geographically agnostic team, so this is kind of directed at Rami perhaps, how do you envision a future of a physical workspace environment? Is it even beneficial to consider?
I think it depends on what you're going to be using that physical workspace for. I think if it's a benefit for employees, you might want to, where you have some segment of your employees that want to be in office, that might be something where you go to a WeWork for, and that's a perk that you provide to your employees, that you say, hey, you can go mingle with each other or mingle with other people in a WeWork. If the point of it is collaboration, then you want to figure out, how do I bring the people, my team together? Does it make sense to have a permanent office to bring them to as a central hub? Or do I need, or can we, make this a more fun activity for us? For example, we bring the entire company together, but we pick different cities. So now it becomes a work trip where everybody flies together. We get to do some different activities and to build team building. And at the same time, we get the in-person collaboration that we want on a quarterly basis.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, so in the wake of the OSHA vaccination mandates, which are now stayed, and similar laws that exempt remote employees from requirements that apply to employees who are in a physical location together. Let me stop there. Is that true? I didn't know that.
About the OSHA mandate?
Yeah, so does it exempt employees who are remote?
Yeah, so if you're not coming into an office, there's not a requirement under Biden's mandate.
Okay, so how much are you finding that legal, compliance, and liability concerns are driving location decisions for startups?
I haven't seen, like, among my clients, I haven't seen like, oh, well, we're gonna go move to Texas because the laws are too strict here in California. Every once in a while, you get like a little quip about that from a client, particularly if they're based in San Francisco, because there's a lot of local rules there. But I haven't seen it drive necessarily where you decide to locate, unless, if you're really starting from scratch and you're saying, I want a jurisdiction that's more friendly to employers. I have seen folks talk about Texas, of course, just given the circumstances. It tends to be a pretty employer-friendly state, like Florida as well. But no, and Christine, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but I haven't seen like a mass push of Like, let's get out of states where things are more difficult to comply with. And obviously Biden's mandate is a federal mandate, so it applies no matter what, across the
Yeah, I
United
haven't
States.
seen it either, Shiva. I think that it's a factor people take into consideration, but it's not the top three. Yeah, in terms of location.
Okay. So we're at Stanford, so we have some students in the audience, and people are curious whether any of the decisions on the workplace model will impact internships for students.
Gosh, I mean, again, that is going to depend upon how the work of the company is done, right? If you're talking about internships in a clean room in a medical device company, they're going to have to be in person. And if the company's working in person, they can still have those internship programs that are possible. I don't see it actually affecting internships that much, because if the work is virtual, it can be done virtually. So I think there will still be a robust internship programs available. I do think there was a huge pause on that during the pandemic because everybody was trying to figure themselves out. And I'm seeing a movement back, maybe not to as many formal internships programs as existed in the past, but definitely an uptick in internships available.
Yeah, and I would say most startups are always excited about free labor. So I don't know that there's going to be a big shortage. And I have seen clients engage interns, particularly earlier in the pandemic, in different states, right? Like if an intern was on the East Coast at school and wasn't going to come back home to the West Coast, just engaging them in that way. If you're going to pay your interns, though, you still need to comply with the laws in that state. So just be careful there. But I hope the students still have hope that they can get internships. I think they'll still be out there.
I think they should be writing to employers to request internships. I think that will be well received, for Shiva's point.
Sure, at Stanford they are.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can get one more question in. So what about sick time accrual for remote workers? Is there a consideration, A, during the pandemic where employees have no choice, versus B, when employees elect to work remotely, versus C, when they're assigned to a location?
All you, Shiva.
So whether, like, I don't know if I understand the question. So it's saying, like, should you differentiate sick leave benefits based on? That's
my understanding, based on when there's no choice, everybody's required to work remotely versus electing to work remotely.
I haven't seen any clients differentiate either sick or vacation benefits based on how you're working and where you're located and whether you're remote or whether you're not. The vast majority of my clients, and I'm sure Christine would agree, want to take a whole company approach and typically don't want to treat different people differently based on how they're working or where they're working. And in fact, many who are based in California or New York will provide California level benefits and leaves to everybody, even though they're not required to. So I haven't personally seen a shift or a change in that at all.
Okay.
I would completely agree.
Well, we are right at time. I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us today and for your questions, and a big thank you to the speakers for their time and insights. I hope everyone has a great day. I look forward to seeing you at the next Rock Center event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.